I'm Mark Halperin.
And I'm John Heilemann. And with all due respect to Donald Trump, we bet you're wishing that National Teflon Day, which is today, had arrived just a little bit earlier. Happy putting Wisconsin in the rearview mirror day, sports fans. And with that in mind, 3 New Yorkers, a Texan and a Buckeye, walk into a primary. We'll see how that joke ends. After the frontrunners in both parties were defeated by double digits in the Badger State yesterday, all the candidates are now turning their sights to this here Empire State. On the Democratic side, a Brooklyn native and former New York senator are both trying to play up their hometown roots. Hillary Clinton did a pair of cable TV interviews today, the first with our friends over at Morning Joe, where she took a few subtle jabs at Bernie Sanders, and the second was CNN later in the day, where Clinton's approach to her Democratic rival was anything but subtle.
Senator Sanders' campaign manager, Jeff Weaver, said something very interesting, inflammatory on our air here, saying that, the Clinton campaign, Secretary Clinton, they need to be careful not to destroy the Democratic Party merely in pursuit of her own ambition to be president. Very strong words. Your response to that idea?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just ludicrous on the face of it. I have been campaigning for Democrats, fundraising for Democrats, recruiting Democrats to run and win for a really long time, I think about 40 years. I understand they're getting anxious. I get that. But they need to be thoughtful about what they do say, because at the end of the day, we need a Democratic president. He's been campaigning now for a year on his core message of inequality, which I absolutely agree with, and I've put forth my own plans. And in the interview, it seemed unclear as to whether he understood how Dodd-Frank works. I think, a little bit, surprised that there didn't seem to be a lot of substance to what he was saying.
So, Mark, she went after him hard. Harder than I think I've seen her go after him indirectly just in that interview today. Do you think that she is behaving this way, taking on Sanders more aggressively, because she is a little worried, or because she senses that his jugular is exposed and she can go get it?
She's not worried. She knows from her campaign's point of view she's going to be the nominee. She's personally frustrated, I believe, and she wants him out of the race. Yeah. And she wants him to stop winning. He's not going to get out of the race if he keeps winning primaries and caucuses. Right. She's trying to go after him the way candidates do, to have him stop winning. Not because she's worried he's going to get more delegates, but because she wants him out of the race so she can focus on the general election.
There are times when campaigns send around remarks that are made by their rivals, and they're trying to gin up controversy, and it's obviously just political posturing. I think that if you know Hillary Clinton and the way in which she is, the policy wonk she is, I think she probably is personally offended by how vapid on some level some of Sanders' responses were to those questions. She, I think, is genuinely like, I cannot believe this guy could, and the double standard we talked about yesterday on the show. If I answered these questions this way, I'd be torn apart. I think there's some of that's seeping through here. In addition to frustration, she's also just kind of amazed, and in some ways probably appalled by how weak Sanders was on substance yesterday with that interview.
If he can beat her in New York, this contest will go to June in California.
Oh, yeah.
And that means Hillary Clinton will gain no advantage having wrapped up her nomination fight any sooner than Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, because they'll go to June, too, no matter what. She wants that. She doesn't want that. She wants him out of the race. So she's trying to take advantage of what she sees as some weaknesses now to get him out. And she thinks the weaknesses are abundant. And she also knows, I know at least one of her advisors knows, and she probably does too, that New York is a place where if you aren't playing offense, you're playing defense.
Right, for sure.
And they want to go after Sanders in the context of the looming debate and the New York media.
And I do think that it is the case that they know this is going to be a competitive state. But unlike in Wisconsin, where they said very early that they thought they were probably in trouble and they were being honest about it, I think the extent to which they think it's competitive here, they're slightly overstating. I think they're confident that they can actually beat him here, and she is going for that jugular.
All right. Speaking of Bernie Sanders, last night, as we said, the Vermont senator pulled off a big win against Clinton in Wisconsin. He beat her 57% to 43%. His win got him 47 delegates. She took 36 during his victory speech and today as his surrogates and staffers appeared on television. Sanders' campaign continued to say they've got the momentum now on their side to secure the nomination this summer, while the Clinton campaign is saying the simple delegate math makes the Sanders scenario improbable, headed towards impossible. So, John, going forward, if you were making the best case for Sanders being the Democratic nominee, how does that play out?
Well, the best case for it is he does win here in New York, despite I think that she's the front runner here for sure. And that momentum out of Wisconsin and New York carries him forward to some surprising victories in places like Pennsylvania, where the race is actually surprisingly close, maybe in New Jersey. He takes her on and beats her in California. I'm not saying these are high likelihood, but that's the best case scenario for him. He manages to ride this momentum and win a bunch of those states and get close enough in the pledged delegates that he can start making the argument that he's a better candidate in the general election against Trump or Cruz than she is.
You know what Sinatra said, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. If he beats her here and you look at the calendar coming up, a lot of states, if he wins New York, he could beat her in. Yeah. And again, the guy's not going to get out of the race.
Nope.
But he still needs relatively big wins, and starting with New York. Then he needs some prominent superdelegates to express doubts about her.
Yep.
He needs the head-to-head national polls to continue to favor him against mythical matchups against the Republicans. And then he probably needs another intervening event. Something with the email investigation, something with the Clinton family, something else that causes Democrats to say, wait a minute, maybe we should go to the convention like the Republicans are doing. Right. And have this out as a family in Philadelphia.
Again, if you're playing this out from Sanders' point of view, the strength of his argument, if he can get close, really close with pledged delegates on the superdelegate front, is that what they are designed to do is to keep the party from nominating someone who's unelectable. Right now, in most head-to-head polls, he is performing better than her against Republican rivals. Some cases substantially better. So again, if you're making the case from his side, that will be in theory, a powerful argument to say to superdelegates, hey, look, I'm better than she is in a general election. You should come to me.
Yeah, as they're saying about just saying in the Morning Joe interview, when Joe asked Hillary Clinton, should Bernie Sanders get out? She said, well, I remember when people forced me to get out.
Or tried to.
I tried to. Force him. I was doing well. I didn't want to get out. If Sanders still wins, so rather than trying to force him out, she basically, I think, give him permission. As long as he keeps winning, she can't argue he should be out of the race with explicitness.
That's why New York matters so much. All right,
yep.
After his whopping win in Wisconsin, Ted Cruz has now marginalized John Kasich more than ever before and set up a one-on-one in some ways with him and Donald Trump. Today, Cruz was in the Bronx, making his first public appearance since his victory speech last night. He met with some local pastors and then stood before the New York media to unveil a somewhat tweaked anti-Trump framing for this New York primary and beyond.
Donald can always be counted on to take the high road and to demonstrate class. If he wants to engage in insults, he's welcome to do so. He gets very angry when the voters reject him. The day before yesterday, Donald Trump promised a, quote, big victory in Wisconsin. And not only did he not get a big victory, but the men and women of Wisconsin resoundingly rejected his campaign. And the reason is simple. Donald has no solutions to the problems we're facing. He likes to yell and scream and insult and curse. If you want to know what liberal democratic values are, follow Donald Trump's checkbook. He has been funding these policies.
So, Mark, you were up there in the Bronx today. You saw that event. I'm asking the same questions we just talked about with Sanders. Given everything that's gone on, Cruz's win and his new framing, what's the best case scenario now in the long run overall for Ted Cruz?
He's emphasizing both his anti-Trump message, but also the economy. And I think he's got to become a populist economic candidate. So interestingly today, he said, you won't hear Republicans say this much, Bernie Sanders is right. He said Bernie Sanders says that the rich has gotten too rich under Barack Obama. We need the middle class, the working class to do better. He needs an economic message. He needs an anti-Trump message that works. And he needs to win. He needs to win in some. He needs to keep winning in some states. Wisconsin cannot be a one-off. And given that the contests are in the Northeast for the most part, in the next month, it's going to be tough for him to win, but he's got to do surprisingly well in those states and maybe win one.
I think he's got to win one. I
just say he got to win Indiana.
Right,
got to beat him in Indiana.
Beat him in Indiana. I think, if he could somehow pull off a win in Pennsylvania, it's a state where Rick Santorum once won statewide. It's not impossible for a guy like Ted Cruz to win in Pennsylvania. Win a couple of those states, win a bunch of the most conservative congressional districts in California, be able to force a contested convention, and then with the strength of his organization, put himself in a position where he can say, the party is rejecting Donald Trump. He's not a real conservative. You got to come to me because I'm number two.
They got to keep doing the underground work of lining up delegates, both pledged and unpledged. All right, coming up, a deep dive into the battle here in the Empire State in both parties after these words from our sponsors. After last night's shellacking in Wisconsin, we haven't heard much from Donald Trump today. The exception, after a spokesperson's statement last night, was a tweet that came earlier today. So far, that's all we've heard. It said, quote, "It's so great to be back home." And then he plugged his big rally tonight, where thousands are expected, on Long Island. As the man who has built an empire pivots here to the Empire State, where he lives, polls have him leading with more than double the numbers of the two remaining rivals in the race, Kasich and Cruz. John, should Kasich and Cruz even bother to do what Cruz did today, Kasich has done during the week, which is campaign here in New York?
Well, I think that they're different. They're in different places, Kasich and Cruz. I think there are some districts, and we can talk about this in more detail. There's some districts where they can be competitive. The rules here are that if you get over 50 and the other people get below 20, you can get all the delegates by congressional district. I think, that John Kasich, if I were him, if you're in the delegate accumulation business, as a wise person once pointed out is John Kasich's business these days, I'd move on and start thinking about Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, spend my relatively limited resources in those places. I think Ted Cruz, there's places he can fight here and pick up some delegates.
Some delegates, but it's really a tough choice because if you don't campaign here, you're left out of the narrative. But Trump is going to kill in this state, barring some change. I don't care what kind of Trump slump there might be. He is going to maybe win every delegate in the state, maybe.
Maybe.
And so to come here, you're not going to spend money on broadcast television. Targeting these individual districts is difficult in most cases because of the way they are not fully neatly aligned with media markets. Right. So I think they'll be here some, but man, Trump is in a really strong position. There's private polling that shows him well above 50, and it's spread out across the state. He's not a city candidate. Right. In fact, the city has many of the districts that he's weakest in potentially.
Well, potentially. We asked, we had one of our crack staff people talk to David Wasserman from the Cook Political Report, who points out, generally the places where Trump would be weakest were the places where people are most highly educated. A lot of those places are in Manhattan. And the places in Manhattan are not places where Cruz, given his evangelical orientation, is going to play particularly well. So I may come around to your point of view. It might just make sense, in fact, to just say Donald's a New York guy and have Cruz and Kasich just get the hell out of here.
I mean, look, both Cruz and Kasich won their home states and made a big deal of it. Yeah. Trump is going to win the state, obviously. I think he's almost certainly going to get above 50 statewide. And again, he'll get 50 in a lot of districts. They got to come here, do television interviews, try to make a case against
Try to stay in the conversation.
Exactly. But I think they're making a mistake to come here and try to pick off delegates because the story in 2 weeks is going to be Trump romp.
Right. And I think, look, it'll be interesting to see what the Cruz campaign does because, as we all know, they are very sophisticated about this kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see in the next 72 hours, 96 hours, whether we see a lot of Ted Cruz actually trying to do things and what he's doing, where he goes, or whether they just basically fly, do air war and get out of here.
In terms of both the narrative and momentum and the delegate accumulation game, it is a fool's errand here for anybody but Donald J. Trump, billionaire.
All right. After Ted Cruz won last night in Wisconsin, it's becoming increasingly likely that we're looking at a contested Republican convention come July in Cleveland. Both of the leading Republican candidates, those are, of course, Trump and Cruz, they're not particularly the most popular guys in Washington, D.C. And as the grand old party braces for a tense week out there in Rock and Roll City, some in the establishment are looking for a white knight. This morning, the editor of the Weekly Standard, Bill Kristol, was asked about this very question on Morning Joe.
Who are 2 to 3 Republicans that could, if not Paul Ryan, could get in there? Do we go back to the Jebs, the Marcos?
No.
You can't have people that lost before.
No, I don't think so. I think some statesman-like type who's... it's hard. No, none of them is quite right.
So who is this person, this imaginary person?
None of them is quite right. If John Kyle were 5 years younger, if Condi Rice were more conservative, there are senior people on the Republican side who you could imagine delegates after 6 or 7 deadlock battle, after a real deadlock, saying, you know what, this guy or woman is a serious leader of our party. It's just hard to come up with a name.
So Bill Kristol does not want Donald Trump to win at all. And like everybody else who doesn't want Donald Trump to win, they're praying for a contested convention. So why are people like Kristol and others, why are they having such a hard time coming up with the answer that they're begging for? They want this scenario. They need a white knight. Why can't they name him?
It's hard. A lot of the people who I think would have been on the list ran and failed. And therefore, as Kristol suggested, they're out. And that's a lot of people think that. You need to be someone who the establishment will like and the Tea Party will like, and who Trump and Cruz, if not themselves, at least some of their forces would say, yeah, that person would be really good. And I've been racking my brain. I brought up Dick Cheney the other day in front of a group of people. I was laughed at.
I'll laugh at. Can I laugh at you now?
Bush 41. To me, it's Ryan. And Kristol says it's not going to be Ryan. To me,
you said Bush 41?
Yeah, he's constitutionally eligible to have one more term. Ryan is the answer, and it's complex as heck.
Yes.
But Ryan is the answer. There's nobody
I
else.
don't understand why it's so hard to answer this question. I think for a lot of Republicans out there, I don't know why Bill Kristol has such a hard time with it. Paul Ryan is the obvious answer, and I think the likely answer.
Yeah. And the Ryan
the only one. He's the only answer.
I say this on TV, the Ryan people beat me up and say it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen. But for the very same reasons he was a consensus choice for Speaker, excuse me, he has some moderate positions on immigration, etc. But
the dude is really conservative. He's really
conservative.
He's really conservative.
And Paul Ryan would go into a general election ready.
Right. Well,
picking up from a standing start at the convention.
And he's look, and he not only that, he's run a national campaign before as Mitt Romney's running mate. He was actually, for a lot of conservatives, he was reassuring when Romney put him on the ticket back in 2012. He's tested in that sense, and he could have a fresh start without having to be totally green, right? In terms of a national campaign.
Yep.
I think he's the ideal
and with
answer.
all due respect to Chairman Priebus from Wisconsin, Paul Ryan's close friend, who says, "Oh, our nominee will be one of the three people in the race." He
has to say that.
He has to say that. And Ryan has to say he's not interested, just like he said he wasn't interested in Speaker until the moment when, if there's a deadlock, they turn to the man from Janesville. Coming up, we kick back into cruise control. We'll talk with NBC's Hallie Jackson about the cruise future right after this. As we mentioned, Ted Cruz took his post-Wisconsin victory lap where any Texan would normally go, to the Bronx, shifting his focus and to some extent his message in advance of the April 19th New York primary. That's in 2 weeks. In any other city, this would have been a pretty simple event. Candidate goes to restaurant, meets with local community leaders, takes a few questions from the assembled media. But in Gotham City, there ain't nothing simple.
Ted, do you know that this is an immigrant community? Yeah, this is an immigrant community.
God bless you. We support you.
Ma'am, listen, security's right behind you, and they're going to clear a path.
From the South Bronx, the poorest congressional district in the United States.
There's no more space.
It was, as you can see, a little bit of a media madhouse. Cruz had to push through a swarm of journalists just to talk with any of the actual voters who were there and to get to his own press availability. Protesters shouted, reporters got shoved, there were questions in multiple languages. I got hit in the head with a camera about a minute after I arrived, par for the course in New York. Here with us now, one of the reporters who also deserves combat pay for covering a 3-question press availability, Hallie Jackson, who covers Cruz.
For the record, not my camera that hit you in the head.
It wasn't.
So you say.
Although one of your many cameras that was there almost hit me in the head, too. I look over at the man holding the camera. So you asked about what I was going to ask about if I had been called on, which is Cruz talking about New York values as a negative thing. How does a guy who pretty much trashes New York, including today a little bit, although mostly tries to trash liberal New York leaders, how does he come here and appeal to New Yorkers having trashed New York values?
For like 2.5 months, right? That was his big line against Donald Trump out in Iowa was, well, everybody knows what New York values really are. But you said it, Mark, and you heard it from him here today. He's shifting a little bit, right? So now he's calling it liberal democratic values that just so happen to be here in New York. So he's trying to make the case to conservatives in places like Western New York, which is another place he talked about. Did you notice that? He said, hey, people in Western New York, they get what I'm talking about. It's the same argument that he made against Donald Trump months ago. And he also talked about Pennsylvania, which is another place where he wants to go and compete. You know, the campaign sees this really as the second sort of phase in its strategy now that Cruz has been able to show with wins in obviously Iowa, with wins in Utah, for example, that he can bring together that evangelical vote, the social conservative vote. Now they need to show, and they're hoping that Wisconsin proves that they can pick up moderates, that they can pick up those somewhat conservatives and bring together that, 60% they say of the Republican Party who wants to try and stop Donald Trump.
So Cruz's people are smart, right? That's a very smart campaign operation.
Well organized, yeah.
Well organized. You've got a situation we talked about earlier on the show where the congressional districts in this state that have the highest education level and therefore are maybe less prone to the Trump message are all basically in the 5 boroughs. They're all right around here. Right. So these are not particularly hospitable areas for Ted Cruz. So what does Cruz do to unlock the demographic and geographic riddle that is New York?
So a couple of things. So first, acknowledging, as a campaign aide said to me, that this is a pretty bumpy road for Ted Cruz. I don't think that the campaign believes they're going to come in and beat Donald Trump here, especially not when you look at new polling like the ones out from Monmouth showing that Trump is now broken breaking 50% in polls. So the strategy seems to be to, number one, play in geographic locations in New York. He'll be in Albany tomorrow. He'll be upstate to focus on those areas where he thinks he can peel off delegates, but also to look at places that maybe have a smaller number of Republicans, of conservatives within the district, and then use that organization that you're talking about to drill down on the get out the vote efforts and to do that sort of man-to-man coverage that the campaign likes to do to turn those conservatives out to vote for Cruz.
He talked in Wisconsin about jobs. That was one of the 3 buzzwords.
Yeah.
Today he mentioned, unlocking the potential of the economy. You hear him more than I do. Is he saying anything specific about what he would do on the economy as president?
So he's drilling down on his economic message when it comes to, we saw that in Wisconsin, right? You're right in that he had basically a whole new slogan, gone were the trust Ted signs. You saw him a little bit, but it was jobs, security, and freedom. So he's using that. It was a move for him in Wisconsin to appeal to some of that sort of industrial, sort of Midwest industrial conservative. Now, I think what you're seeing, Mark, is a shift a little bit to coalition-based campaigning. So you're going to see him talking to, you saw him with the Women for Ted Cruz event last week, I think it was, with Heidi Cruz.
But did he ever talk about his tax plan?
Yeah, I mean, he absolutely does. He talks about it on the stump all the time. It was part of his original stump speech before Wisconsin. Right. Flat tax is actually something that you hear not just from Cruz, but from people who like him. I spoke with somebody recently who was deciding, this was back in Wisconsin, who said, hey, I like Trump and Cruz. But the issue of taxes is really important to me, and I want a flat tax. And my producer and I said to him, well, that's Ted Cruz's policy. And he goes, oh, huh. So clearly there's still some messaging there.
Did he mention the flat tax in his speech last night?
In his speech last night,
I don't think he did. I didn't hear it. It certainly wasn't a big. I don't understand.
Let me pull out my verbatim on my phone.
I don't understand a pivot to jobs without any specifics about what you do to bring about jobs.
But I think you're going to see more of that moving forward because, again, I think that once he sort of did the biographical part of his message that he wanted to do early in the campaign, you're going to see him, I think, per the campaign, talk about this more with these different groups, but aiming that message at, like, for example, members of the African-American community, members of the Hispanic community, like you saw him do a little bit today in the Bronx.
We don't have a lot of time, but I want to ask you this last question. There was some discussion a few weeks ago about the notion that Cruz and Kasich might end up kind of either overtly or covertly collaborating because of the nature of the challenge that they face. Now, of course, Cruz is saying, I want John Kasich out of the race.
Right.
Is there any chance that those guys will end up kind of working together one way or the other over the course of the coming weeks?
I'm told no, but the bottom line is when you have the same goal, which is to not let Donald Trump get the nomination, you'll get to the same end, most likely, if you end up there. What I found was interesting was an aide telling me recently that they only started modeling out Kasich within the last couple of weeks. So the fact that he is still in the race is different than they expected as far as this point of where we're in the campaign.
Hallie Jackson.
Is that all we get?
Thanks. It's all we get. Come back.
You're always welcome.
Show's only an hour.
Chairs like waiting here for you anytime you want it.
Coming up, I thought you were going to call me Bubba. And other great moments in New York presidential campaign history.
Yo, Bubba.
You'll love this clip. Stay tuned right after this.
Good morning, Don.
How are you?
Well, I'm all right. I'm disappointed you didn't call me Bubba. That's an honorable term where I come from. It's just Southern for mensch.
Southern for mensch. That was Bill Clinton and Don Imus back in 1992. As our next two guests well remember, New York helped Bill Clinton nab his party's nomination in that fabled year. Now the Empire State is the key for Hillary Clinton's campaign, just like it was for her husband. Here to talk about the state of the race for both parties, two native New Yorkers, John Podhoretz, the editor of commentary and a columnist for the New York Post, and Adam Nagourney, the New York Times Los Angeles bureau chief, but a former tabloid reporter here in this city, who joins us from L.A. Adam, I want to start with you. Just try to convey to anyone who does not understand what a competitive New York primary on the Democratic side, the Republican side, try to convey to people what that's like.
I think every time there's a primary, people hear people like me, New Yorkers, talking about it and think it's not true. It is crazy. It is. New York invented 24/7 before there was 24/7. It's one of the last places in the world, except for maybe London, where you have a really competitive newspaper culture. You have some larger-than-life reporters who really know how to make news, who view their role as trying to provoke, prod candidates. And we saw that. And you also have players in the form of, in '92, was Mario Cuomo and I think David Dinkins, who really like to meddle a bit, which I guess we are seeing now a little bit with Bill de Blasio. And it's just an incredible stew, and it's just really intense. And I believe that Clinton, by the end of that process, liked what happened in New York. But I think as it was going on, after he'd been heckled by an AIDS protester and everything else, he wasn't really having what I would say a New York kind of time.
I got to play devil's advocate, as excited as I am about the next 2 weeks. And I don't want to be one of these old people who talks about the good old days. But like, I went to this cruise event today in the Bronx. There was no reporters there were 3 questions. 2 of them were from national reporters. In my day, if 2 national reporters tried to dominate a press conference with a guy coming off the big win last night, there would have been a revolt. I don't see a tabloid competition the way it is. I don't see local news covering politics the way they used to. Isn't it the case that this is a toned down, slimmed down New York primary as compared to 1992?
Well, sure. I mean, absolutely. And you also have the phenomenon of you had a lot more local talk radio in New York in the 90s that you don't have now. But I think there's a story that you're missing here, which is that this is the first time in our lifetimes that a Republican primary is going to matter at all in any way, shape, or form. Now, I think listening to you guys, you think that Trump has it in the bag. But remember, there are 400,000 registered Republicans in New York City to whom nobody has ever made the slightest gesture, ever. We're not talking about, except for running for Congress, no one has ever looked at them. No one has ever talked to them.
McCain and Bush a little bit.
A little bit, but in 2012, you have districts, 5 congressional districts in which 3,000 people voted in the Republican primary. 3,000 people. The possibilities of playing retail politics games here on the part of Trump, Cruz, and Kasich, that's never happened before in New York.
Adam, from 3,000 miles away, but watching closely, what do you think Bernie Sanders' potential is to make mischief for Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side in the next 2 weeks here?
I think it's high, and I think one of the reasons is because of the New York tabloid culture. New York news reporters have always liked stirring it up. I think they've always liked sticking it to Clinton. I think that Bernie Sanders kind of gets it. The other side of that, though, is, and I think this is really important, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump know the New York culture that we're talking about, which I still think exists. I know your point from before, but I just think it's still a little bit early there. So they know it. They know how to play it. They've been through it, and that's going to matter a lot. And I think that we saw the shortfalls of not really getting it when Sanders did that Daily News interview and made all those, what I would say, intemperate remarks. I'm sure he walked in there thinking, the Daily News, who cares? It's just a dumb tabloid. He made it to Arthur Brown. If you've been around New York, guys like that are kind of legend. And yeah, they're maybe getting older and they might not be getting up to the Bronx as often as they used to, but there's still factors and they really want to make an impact, and they do. And they know their stuff.
Can I make a contrary argument, which is, the Daily News interview is a disaster for Sanders if you assume that the Sanders voter cares about issues. This is the reverse mirror image of Trump. They're not voting on issues. They don't care about issues. They're voting on one thing or 2 things. They're voting on feeling screwed. They're voting on, pitchforking the banks. And we read this and we think, oh my God, this guy can't possibly be allowed to be president. Look, he doesn't know anything, and he's blabbling about nothing. And yet here Sanders is, having won 6 straight. He just won a primary in Wisconsin. He's polling 10 or 11 points behind Hillary.
But to me, that proves the point that in the culture of the New York hothouse media, maybe it doesn't deter Sanders voters, but it gets Hillary's supporters all stoked up, and it creates a firestorm that keeps him from breaking through with it.
Well, that's the question. The question is, how stoked are Hillary supporters anywhere? In Wisconsin last night, her voters in the exit poll said 13% were enthusiastic about the possibility of her being president. 13%. So I don't know that there is stoking. I don't know that they are stoked.
Adam,
that's the big question.
I'm going to ask you both this question, but I'll start with you, Adam. You're out there 3,000 miles away, but you covered Hillary Clinton in this state. It's now a decade since she was elected statewide. She was elected twice statewide here, obviously as senator in 2000, 2006. Does she still have a real hold over the New York Democratic electorate, or is she vulnerable here in a significant way?
I would not assume, I think it's a great question. I would not assume for a second if I was in Brooklyn that she still has a hold. I think she still has to work for it. I think the advantage she has, as we were saying before, is that she lived through the campaign. She gets the culture, so she knows. She has, in addition to winning with her husband, has run two campaigns there, so 3 campaigns. So she knows it. But I would never assume. I don't think there's a kind of heart connection to Hillary Clinton among New York voters than in fact there was for Bill Clinton and for Mario Cuomo and other people over the years. But that said, I think that if I had a choice, I'd rather be her than Bernie Sanders in this culture that we're talking about.
John, let me ask you this question, just as a matter of, of what you do if you're Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders is going to come here. He's going to have huge rallies. Washington Square Park, 15,000 people. He's done one already like this. She's never going to have crowds like that. She never has, not gonna. So what does she do to counter the perception that Bernie Sanders is going to show up in New York and be generating all this enthusiasm very visibly in front of all these cameras here in the media capital of the world?
I would do a lot of local media. That's what I would do. I would talk to every columnist that I could talk to. I would go on the Brian Lehrer show on WNYC 18 times in the next 2 weeks in order to get exactly those, sort of moderate to liberal voters in New York City to remind them how they like her, and I would play that card. I think she also needs to boost her vote among African Americans in some of these northern states. In Wisconsin last night, I mean, it's not bad to get 71%, but in the South, she was getting 90%, 92% of the African American vote. If she can get that number up, she'll be solid in New York. But I don't think there's any relevant indication that she has that, incredibly high percentage in the bank.
Adam, we got to go in a second. Yes or no answer. Will we see Trump either ride the subway or eat a knish before the primary?
Yes on Subway, no on Knish. I'm just totally guessing.
I go no Subway. The man is a germaphobe. Yeah. He ain't getting anywhere near the Subway. Knish, much easier.
He's not eating Knish, that's for sure.
You think not? Why not?
With a fork?
Him? I don't know.
Imagine someone handing him that?
He doesn't have high tastes.
He does use a fork sometimes, so
that's
it's not
true.
Appropriate. Adam Nagourney, please come back to New York, please, in the next 2 weeks.
Okay.
Please, we need you here. John Podhoretz,
thank you, John.
Please stay here. We need you here, too. Thank you both for coming on. Coming up, we'll sit down and talk some politics with Tavis Smiley. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can listen to us, too, on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We will be right back.
Now by the great PBS talker and thinker, host Tavis Smiley. He's got a new book out called 50 for Your Future, Lessons from Down the Road. Tavis, thanks for coming in.
Good to see you both.
How would you, if you were telling some French tourists about the Democratic race for president, and they said, tell us the story of what's happened and what's happening now, how would you explain it to them?
That it is unusual that a party standard bearer would find herself caught in a race that is far from over. The numbers certainly are in her favor, but this race is, I think, still Bernie's. I won't say it's Bernie's to lose. That's putting too much on it. But I think that if he can pull off the upset in New York, we got a real fight on our hands. I mean, every other week, and you guys know this, you cover this stuff more than anybody, but every other week I keep going back and forth on whether or not we're going to have one contested convention or two contested conventions. And I'm not sure on any given week that I know what the answer to that is.
Part of the reason why Hillary Clinton has built such a large pledged delegate lead, maybe an insurmountable one, is because she did so well in a bunch of states, particularly in the South, with large African-American populations, right? She has performed much better with him, well, much better than he has with African-Americans. Do you think that's merited? Is that earned on her part?
Some of it is. There's no doubt about the fact that the Clintons had a good relationship, have had for many years with African Americans. And there's some good and some bad in that. I mean, I say all the time that these are public servants, not perfect servants. Michelle Alexander wrote a brilliant piece that she titled Why Hillary Doesn't Deserve the Black Vote, really explaining, as you both know, how the Clintons let black America down on prison reform, criminal justice reform. Bill Clinton famously went to the NAACP last summer to apologize for the mistake that he made on the crime bill. But on the other hand, Bill Clinton appointed more black judges than any president prior to him. For that matter, all presidents combined, I think, prior to him, Clinton still appointed more black judges. So it's a good news, bad news story. So some of it is merited, no doubt about it. But on the other hand, I don't like it, and I keep saying this. I don't like it when black voters are taken for granted by one party or ignored by the other party. So I think she learned the last time around that when you expect a coronation, you find yourself oftentimes in an election and in a dogfight this time around.
When and if she shows up the nomination, it seems President Obama is going to be more aggressive at speaking on her behalf. How big a factor do you think he can be in a general election, given where his approval rating is and given that he's become, much to his annoyance and frustration, a divisive figure?
I don't know what his impact is going to be outside of the African-American community, to the brilliant point you just made, Mark, because the numbers are what they are. Although they're getting better for him, they're still, the numbers are tenuous. Yeah. With the African-American vote, I have found that it's not an automatic conclusion that one can draw that just because a black person says vote for this person, that all black folk in lockstep are going to do that. There's a huge difference, obviously. I feel like you guys already know this stuff, of course, but there's a huge difference between Barack Obama being on the ballot and Barack Obama campaigning for somebody on the ballot. And I think the Clintons, these are smart people running her campaign. They have to know that there's automatically going to be a drop in the African-American turnout just because this brother is not on the ballot. Right. How much that drop is going to be, I do not know. How much harder then they have to work to make sure the turnout is significant enough to push them over the top is a question, again, I don't know the answer to.
So Bernie Sanders is more in tune with the Democratic base on a wide variety of issues than Hillary Clinton is, and that's part of why he's been able to generate so much enthusiasm and why he's given her such a significant challenge. If you had been asked at the very beginning of the Sanders campaign, listen, we know that we're on the right side of these issues with the base, but we have a demographic problem with Hispanic voters and African-American voters. What should I do? What would you have advised him to do? And how would you kind of assess how well he's done at trying to remedy what was obviously going to be a challenge for him?
The New York Times, as you both saw, wrote, I think, a really good piece the other day, front page, about some of the missteps in the Sanders campaign. And the article hit the nail on the head, I think, which is that he started too late. And that would have been my advice. If you are not known by the African-American community, and if you're trying to take on the person who thinks, again, that she is the presumptive nominee, you better get out there and you better campaign like they vote in Chicago, early and often. And that's what he didn't do. And so what you see now, and I think the story's pretty clear, that had he gotten out earlier, he might have had better success with black voters, who are going to obviously be key in this election, because on the issues, John, on the issues, he's speaking right to where black voters live. He's speaking truth to power on the issues that matter to them, but it's hard to make up for lost time when people just don't know who you are, and when the bets have already been made, and quite frankly, when the breadth and depth of the black political establishment has already lined up behind Secretary Clinton.
Got less than 30 seconds. Who would be a tougher general election candidate in your view, Ted Cruz or Donald Trump?
I think both lead America in the wrong direction, but if I'm the Clinton campaign, I do not want to face Donald Trump.
Why?
Because the conventional wisdom left the train station before the train left the station, and I just don't know. It's such a wild card. It's such a wild card. Cruz is more predictable. Trump just unpredictable.
Okay, Tavis, thank you very much. Appreciate it. New book Tavis has out. You should buy, called 50 for Your Future, Lessons from Down the Road. Up next, the professor, Ken Goldstein, and a lot of data. Interesting data. We'll be right back.
The numbers from Wisconsin are in. I'm talking about the millions of dollars spent by the campaigns on television ads in the Badger State. We called in our political Yoda, Ken Goldstein, to share some deep wisdom. He joins us now from Washington, D.C. Ken, just let me ask you about a national question before we move to Wisconsin. Just where are we right now in terms of the ad wars? What's been spent? Talk about the big number.
So the big number is, to date, $380 million has been spent on the presidential primaries on television advertising, $270 on the Republican side, $110 on the Democratic side. And the rule in politics is usually follow the money, but if you followed the money here, you wouldn't necessarily find the winner, right? Because the majority of dollars spent on the Republican side were on her behalf, two candidates who aren't in the race anymore, and Donald J. Trump, the leader, has only spent $18 million on television advertising.
All right, let's look back. Wisconsin, the two underdogs won. What was spending like there overall?
Yeah. So in Wisconsin, $8.4 million was spent on television advertising, $3.4 on the Democratic side, $5 million on the Republican side. Interestingly, going back to that national numbers for a second, overall Bernie has outspent Hillary $59 million to $51 million. And his advantage in Wisconsin was even more pronounced. So the Sanders campaign spent a little bit over $2.4 million on television, and the Clinton campaign spent $1 million on television. More players, more fragmented on the Republican side, and I like to break things out as sort of Trump or not Trump. And Trump spent $500,000 in Wisconsin, and not Trump spent $4.5 million. Not all of the not Trump was anti-Trump. Some was pro-Cruz and pro-Kasich, but a big chunk of that was focused negatively on the Donald.
Ken, was there any outside Democratic money spent in Wisconsin, or was it all the two campaigns?
Not only was there no outside money in Wisconsin spent on behalf of the Democrats, but there's basically been no outside money at all in the Democratic race to date. Whereas on the Republican side, the majority of the spending has been outside money.
Big difference.
Big difference, yeah, absolutely. Because as we keep talking about, and at least for me, it never gets old. Candidates get a lot more for their buck, 3 or 4 times as much for their buck than the outside groups do.
All right, so Ken, we got Wisconsin now in the rearview mirror. We're headed here to the state that we live in, love, and care about most, New York. What's the ad picture as we head into this New York primary 2 weeks from now?
Well, not much. As you may have noticed in the city that you know and love, things are a little pricier in Gotham than they are in my former home state of Wisconsin. An advertising buy in New York City would be 15 or 20 times more expensive than an advertising buy in Milwaukee. So if the Cruz campaign spent $1 million in Wisconsin, they need to spend $15 or $20 million if they want to play with the same number of impressions in New York. So far, we haven't seen any buy yet on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, Sanders has a fairly modest buy of $670,000, and we just got word of an even more modest buy on the Clinton side, not in New York City, mostly upstate, but only about $130,000 that she's placed.
Do you expect either party's contest to have a lot of television advertising, or just too expensive?
Well, I think it's the ultimate tell. And I think you guys were talking a little bit before that if you were the strategist for each of the campaigns, especially on the Republican side, would you even play in New York, and how heavy would you play? And I got to believe that are the decisions that are being made in those inside meetings in the Cruz campaign or in the super PACs that are supporting him, because you can't play a little bit in New York. If you're going to go in with television, it's got to be a lot of money. And it may just not be the best use of their buck. They may want to save their dollars for other primaries down the line.
All right, Ken Goldstein, you are, as always, pretty much a genius. We're always happy to have you. When we come back, we'll engage in some hypotheticals with a little game that we like to call Engaging in Hypotheticals. After this.
And now it's time for America's favorite game show.
Engaging in Hypotheticals.
Love this show.
All right. Okay, so here's the thing, all right? We're going to engage in a little hypothetical here. My hypothetical to you is you are given the opportunity to tell a candidate to go to the place that most exemplifies great New York pizza. Where would that be?
Oh, that would be Sacco's Pizza on 54th and 9th Avenue.
Really?
Best pizza in New York. Don't eat it with a fork. Eat it with a spoon.
I'd send him to DeForest in Brooklyn, just for the record, all right?
Drop. All right, hypothetical view. Paul Ryan becomes the Republican nominee at the convention as the White Knight. Who does he pick as his running mate?
Oh, if not Whoopi Goldberg, certainly Nikki Haley. You need to get a woman. You need to get a person of color on that ticket to hopefully expand the Republican base.
Ryan and Haley.
Ryan and Haley.
He doesn't pick Mitt Romney, I'll tell you that.
Okay. All right. Head to BloombergPolitics.com, where we have a piece up by Margaret Talib outlining Hillary Clinton's New York prospects. And coming up on Bloomberg West, Emily Chang speaks to Sunrun CEO Lynn Jurick. Until tomorrow, from Mark and me, we have one word to say to you. It's the same word we always say at the end of the day, and that's sayonara.